This is Pastor Appreciation Sunday, and it's always an honor for us to be here with you guys. And I'm not just saying this because I'm not trying to get a nice lunch out of him or anything. Although, if he wants to do that, who's gonna argue with that? But no. But I will say from day one, this couple has been very dear to us. And I even had a prophetic word over them when they started. I'm not going to share with you what it is, but they know what it is. Right. And but we've been watching them, and to walk in this morning, I know my wife and I were commenting, the culture that is here is absolutely amazing. And I remember being at the other building a few times, even before you came, but even especially when you first came, and just to see all that God has done. In 9 years' time, it's phenomenal. Yes. It's phenomenal. And I believe that God has got you guys here for a reason. And what a year you've had. Goodness. I think there's been a few times I've had to talk you off the ledge. With everything. And, you know, God says, want to make them laugh, tell them your plans, and right? And I know, there's been so many times the last couple of years, it looks like things are moving in a direction, and then God just slams the brakes on and you take a left turn. But in the midst of it, God has been in control. That's right. And listen, any place you can meet that has a moose on the bathroom door is, to me, the best place you could ever meet in, right? And I just love it. And but God has provided a space for you, and you guys are such good stewards of it. And I believe, I'm praying that God will just give you the whole building someday, right? Wouldn't that be great? But listen, God has great things for you, and so we're so proud of you. And I wanted to share a vision message with all of you today because I know that's where you've been at, and I want how you look at things, how you look at obstacles and challenges determines so much more than what you could even imagine. And we're going to be sharing a few of our little stories, my wife and I, today, about we were church planters for 7 years, and I'll share a little bit more about that in a minute. But there were times we had to live by faith for everything. And I will say this, looking back on it, that God is always faithful. Right? And so we're so proud of you. I want to talk about today what you are ruled by. What you are ruled by. And we're going to look at the whole story of Caleb and Joshua sending in the 12 spies into the promised land to kind of scope it out. And how most of you know the story, but 10 of them saw things one way, 2 of them saw things another way. And it's all in how you look at something is what determines it. So we're going to start in Numbers chapter 13. And it says, "The Lord now said to Moses, 'Send out men to explore the land of Caanan, the land I am giving to the Israelites. Send one leader from each of the 12 ancestral tribes.' So Moses did as the Lord commanded him. He sent out 12 men, all tribal leaders of Israel, from their camp in the wilderness of Paran." In verse 18, it says, Moses said, "See what the land is like, and find out whether the people living there are strong or weak, few or many. See what kind of land they live in. Is it good or bad? Do their towns have walls, or are they unprotected like open camps? Is the soil fertile or poor? Are there many trees? Do your best to bring samples of the crops you see. It happened to be the season for harvesting the first ripe grapes." So they were on a search mission to scope out the land, see what was there. This was the land that God had promised them. And, it would have made more sense if the land was just empty and God just took them to the gate and said, "Okay, this is all yours." It was inhabited by the enemy. and they were big. They were big. They were a formidable foe. And so a lot of times before you walk in what God has given you, there's a battle that takes place on the front end, right? And so these men came back from that scouting trip, and they had conflicting views. And so I believe that this all goes back to the way that some of them chose to see things. And so I want to ask you a question today. Are you going to allow yourself to be guided by fear, or are you going to allow yourselves to be guided by faith? And I believe that there's probably some people here today that you're at a crossroads. You're walking into a new season, and it's very easy to be seized by fear. But God brought me here today to share this with you, that you need to look a little bit higher than the difficulty and see beyond it, and you can start walking by faith. And I believe this is a word for the church as well. 10 of them, it's important to say, missed out on the purposes of God because of the way they chose to look at things. So they missed out because when you're ruled by what you see, you can miss out on God's purposes for your life. When you're ruled by what you see. We're always taught, to see first and then have faith second. But God always teaches us to have faith first when you can't see, and then you see the way he sees. And that's just totally opposite of the way we're wired, right? I need to have the proof, right, first? That's not the way God works. I don't know why. Verse 28, they came back and they said, but the people living there are powerful and their towns are large and fortified. We even saw giants there, the descendants of Anak. So they were talking about what they had seen with their eyes. 10 of them could only see giants. 2 of them came back and they saw through the giants and saw the goodness of the land. And you know what? There's so many people that will just stop short and they'll just look at the problem in front of them and not see beyond it and see the goodness of the Lord beyond it. I heard a story years ago, and it was probably 100 years ago, and there was a guy that, I'm not that old, by the way. I was in kindergarten back then. So there was a shoe salesman that they sent to Africa, right? And they sent him there, and he came back, and they said, how was it? He said, terrible. It'd be a terrible place to sell shoes. Nobody wears shoes. And so they sent another person to Africa, same place, and they came back and said, what do you think? He said, it is ripe. Nobody wears shoes. You see the different ways of looking at it, right? And so I wonder what would happen if we begin to look through the obstacles and giants that we face and see through them and see the promises of God for our lives. You know, even with the building situation that you guys have just walked through, I know it seems like, you guys have had to pivot and take a step back and all, but no, you are moving right in the perfect timing and will of God. Right? That's what you need to hold on to. And God is, you're looking through fire detectors and that long list that they give you, right, when you meet with them. It's overwhelming. You're looking past that and seeing the promises of God. So Moses asked them 6 questions we just read a moment ago. And the first one was, he said, what was the land like? And the only thing they agreed on, all 12 of them, was that the land was awesome. That's the only time they agreed. And from that point on, they disagreed, the 10 versus the 2. And it says in verse 23, when they came to the valley of Eshcol, they cut down a branch with a single cluster of grapes so large that it took 2 of them to carry it on a pole between them. You don't find that at Lidl, right there, right? Right? They also brought back samples of the pomegranates and figs. That place was called the Valley of Eshcol, which means cluster, because of the cluster of grapes the Israelite men cut there. After exploring the land for 40 days, the men returned to Moses, Aaron, and the whole community of Israel at Kadesh in the wilderness of Paran. They reported to the whole community what they had seen and showed them the fruit they had taken from the land. This was their report to Moses. We entered the land you sent us to explore, and it is indeed a bountiful country, a land flowing with milk and honey. Here's the kind of fruit it produces. They bring this big cluster of grapes. They all saw the potential, but 10 refused the risk and rejected their future that God had for them because they weren't willing to take a risk. Most of us, probably all of us, love to live safe, right? We just love it. And I want to tell you that the will of God never comes without risk, without stepping out of our comfort zones and into the unfamiliar. So about 30 years ago, my wife and I were on staff at a church in Michigan, and we were there about 10 years, and I was bringing construction teams to Newark, New Jersey to renovate inner city churches. I have a background in the trades, and so that was right up my alley. And every time I'd come to New Jersey, and hang out in New York, and there would be something in my heart that just would come alive. And every time we'd go, drive back after the trip was over, I felt like I was leaving something behind. And so around 1995, early 1995, God really stirred my heart and said, you guys are going to be moving to the East Coast. And my wife wasn't quite on board yet. If you're a new dad in here, I'm going to share with you a little gem, something that you should never do. My wife was pregnant for our son Scott, and I called her from a basement payphone in a restaurant in Manhattan, and I said, honey, we're moving to New York, to Brooklyn. Yeah, don't do that. Don't do that. It didn't go well. It took a few more years after that to kind of work through that. And so God had put it in my heart. And so on one of those trips, I had landed in this town of Hackensack, New Jersey, and thought it was a pretty cool town. And Bill and Joel sang about it, so it's got to be cool, right? Who needs a house out in Hackensack? Is that all you get for your money? No? All right. All right. And so we had heard that this church, actually it was a fleece that we put out before the Lord, and this missionary called us and said, hey, you wouldn't be interested in coming and restarting this church, would you? And I'm like, I don't know. And he said, we've got two ladies at this church they're brand new Christians. They just got saved. It's in a rented dance studio. We have no money. There's no income. There's nothing. But two ladies. And the Newark Teen Challenge was running the services. But the city is a 4 square mile city at the time, 40,000 plus people, very multicultural. And he said, if you're not interested, we're just going to close it. We've been trying to get it off the ground for years. So literally, we go from a church, we're on staff, it's about 1,200 people, and we're taking a church of 2. Now, we had rapid growth because when we got there, we had 2 kids, so we grew to 6 within a week. Tell me that's not church growth right there. But we had drove out there. My wife and I prayed about it. We counted the cost, and I'm telling you, it was scary. I'd never been so scared in my life because we had just bought a house a couple of years before. My wife and I are thrifters, and we would at that season of our life, our kids were 6 and 4. We collected jungle gyms people were getting rid of. So it looked like Six Flags in my yard. I had like 5 jungle gyms I put together. I'm sure OSHA would not have been happy with me. It was crazy. But we had built this house. We had built a home at this house, thinking our kids were going to be raised there. I was on staff. Everything was stable, safe. I could have stayed there indefinitely. I was involved in our district in the Assemblies of God. Had some positions there. Everything was just safe, and I was miserable. And when God spoke to us about leaving, we came back. We talked to our pastor, and we said we're going to resign in 6 weeks, and we're going to go to Hackensack and start a church. And we had deacons come to us and say, you're walking out of the will of God. This is not God, that you would take your family into that. And they were just worried about us, and I was too. And so we put our house on the market, and it sold. And I remember we were going back and forth to New Jersey. My wife and I would take a week, and then she'd come back, and then I'd go a week. We were trying to find housing, because in Michigan in those days, my house payment was under $500 a month. Yeah, wouldn't you love that today, right? And we were going to a place at the time where it was, $1,300, $1,400 a month for an apartment, and it was just with no income. Anyway, and so we ended up finding an apartment, and we put a deposit down on it, and I remember we sold everything we had. And what grieved me the most was I just bought a brand new riding lawnmower, red, beautiful, nice stripes on it, just nice riding lawnmower. We sold everything we owned, and whatever was left over, we put in the back of a U-Haul truck. And so I remember the night before we left, we had cleaned out the house. My wife had went to her parents with the kids because we were leaving first thing in the morning to head east. And I was in the moving truck, and I jumped up into the driver's seat, And I put my hands on the big steering wheel, and I was looking around the yard, remembering all the memories of the kids playing on the jungle gym and in the yard and the house that we had worked so hard to get. And I just remember just this fear seized me, and I thought, what are you doing? You just resigned? You have no income, no health insurance, nothing. I mean, what are you doing? And the only thing I could tell you is I just had such a passion in my heart because I knew God had told me to do it. And I started to sob and weep, thinking I am the biggest failure. My reputation's gonna be shot. People were telling me this is not what you should do. And as I'm crying, and I just could picture God having such a sense of humor with me. I'm crying, and I'm sucking air. It was an ugly cry. You got stuff coming out of your, I'm banging on the steering wheel. And I almost pictured in my heart, it was weird, I pictured God just like this going, are you done yet? Like, are you done? And I remember I started laughing. And see, I was losing it. I was having a mental breakdown for sure. And I start laughing, and I remember that God had just impressed on my heart. He spoke to me and just said, don't worry about anything. The first thing you have to do is put the key in and start it, put it into gear, and don't look back. And that's what I did. And back in those days, Stephen Curtis Chapman he was a gospel artist. He still is, but back in those days he was, and he had this song out called The Great Adventure. And I remember, I think it was on a cassette. And I remember I played that thing on a loop for literally 14 hours driving east. Because if I stopped playing it, I wanted to do a U-turn and go back. And if you've never heard that song, you want a faith booster, just listen to The Great Adventure. You're going to love it. And there's some great guitar parts in there too, by the way. Anyway, so we made it there, and it was such an unbelievable experience. We had to pray in every single thing that you could imagine. But we were out on a limb with Jesus, but we had never felt so alive in our faith. And at the church that we were at for 10 years, we learned a ton about ministry and how to pastor and all that. In those 7 years of church planting, we learned a ton about God. And that was what we needed. And so the decisions you make today will affect your offspring for generations to come. Little did we know that we would end up on Eastern Long Island eventually, and that both of our kids would meet their mates here and raise their families here. See, God had all of that in mind when we said yes. When I was in that driveway and wanted to just back out on everything, all of that was at stake. So whatever you're struggling with right now, you need to understand that it's bigger than just you. It goes beyond that. Even this church, what you're doing now is for the generations that are coming behind you. For you to function at your best, there has to be the ability to step out of the boat and take a risk. I'm telling you, someone here needs to hear that. I don't know what that means in your context, but someone needs to hear that. The truth is, living in a box is just no way to live. What a boring life, right? But not all of the 12 had the same attitude as the 10. I love in verse 24, God says, but my servant Caleb has a different attitude than the others have. He has remained loyal to me, and this is what I'm talking about with the generations to come. I will bring him into the land he explored. His descendants will possess their full share of the land. 2 weeks ago, we had Youth Sunday, and my 11-year-old granddaughter emceed our service, and she did a better job than most of the adults. And I was sitting there on the verge of an ugly cry again, because I'm thinking, that's the blessing right there of saying yes 30 years ago. And so the person who lives a life guided by faith understands that they're going to make decisions that will impact generations, and that your children will possess the land that you've taken now. You can also miss out on the purposes of God when you're ruled by your weakness. When you're ruled by your weakness. The second question Moses asked was Joshua. No, Moses. What am I doing? Moses. Yeah, I'm good. Whatever. It just doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter. No, I'm playing with you guys. He said, "Are the people strong or weak?" This is what happens when you hit your 60s, man. Where am I? What happened to anyway? Might need some help out to the car afterwards. The 10 said this in verse 28, but the people living there are powerful, and their towns are large and fortified. We even saw giants there, the descendants of Anak. And so they were looking at the struggles and the difficulties and the challenges. And it says, so they spread this bad report about the land among the Israelites. The land we traveled through and explored will devour anyone who goes to live there. All the people we saw were huge. We even saw giants there, the descendants of Anak. Next to them, we felt like grasshoppers, and that's what they thought too. And they were kind of dramatic, weren't they? Little drama queens there. The way we see and perceive things makes all the difference. Caleb had an entirely different report. He said in chapter 14, verse 9, don't rebel against the Lord, and don't be afraid of the people of the land. They are only helpless prey to us. They have no protection, but the Lord is with us. Don't be afraid of them. See the difference? Yes. Are you ruled by your weakness, or are you keenly aware of God's strength? The moment that I'm ruled by my weakness, I will never take the risks that I would potentially take, that I would never fulfill the capacity of my potential that God has given me. When I'm ruled by my weakness, what are the areas of weakness that you struggle with? That you're not good enough, that you don't have enough money, that others are better than you, that you're not gifted like others? The truth is, the Bible says that your weakness ends up being your strength. 2 Corinthians 12, Paul said, my grace is all you need. My power works best in weakness. So now I am glad to boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ can work through me. That's why I take pleasure in my weaknesses and in the insults, hardships, persecutions, and troubles that I suffer for Christ. For when I am weak, I am strong. You will miss out on the purposes of God also when you're ruled by the way you feel. Be careful of your feelings. They can lead you astray. As we just read, they said we felt like grasshoppers there. That's what we felt like. They were very emotional. I love 2 Corinthians 6 in the Message paraphrase. It says, Dear Corinthians, I can't tell you how much I long for you to enter into this wide open, spacious life. We didn't fence you in. The smallness you feel comes from within you. Your lives aren't small, but you're living them in a small way. I'm speaking as plainly as I can and with great affection. Open up your lives, live openly and expansively. How cool is that verse? One of the seasons in taking us to this country only to have us die in battle. That's what the 10 said. Our wives and our little ones will be carried off as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to return to Egypt? Man, we just read this a minute ago. My servant Caleb has a different attitude. He has remained loyal to me. His descendants will possess their full share of the land. I love in chapter 14, verse 31, it says, you said your children will be carried off as plunder. Well, I will bring them safely into the land, and they will enjoy what you have despised. But as for you, you will drop dead in this wilderness. In other words, dead to the purposes of God. And your children will be like shepherds wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. In this way, they will pay for your faithlessness until the last of you lies dead in the wilderness. It affected everybody. Moses went on to say, are there walls or open fields? The 10 said, but the people living there are powerful, and their towns are large and fortified. Caleb came back and said, do not rebel against the Lord, and don't be afraid of the people of the land. They are only helpless prey. They have no protection. How can you have two completely different views? They either have protection or they don't. Do you see obstacles or opportunities in your life? The last question Moses asked them was, is the soil fertile or poor? 10 of them said, so they spread this bad report about the land among the Israelites. The land we traveled through and explored will devour anyone who goes to live there. Caleb comes back and says, 2 of the men who had explored the land, Joshua son of Nun and Caleb son of Jephunneh, tore their clothing. They said to all the people of Israel, the land we traveled through and explored is a wonderful land, and if the Lord is pleased with us, he will bring us safely into that land and give it to us. It is a rich land flowing with milk and honey. I'd like to call the band up, and the last thing I want to talk about is that you will miss out on the purposes of God when you refuse to own it. And what I mean by this is that when the going gets tough, you start to put blame on people. Sometimes your pastor. And not here, though, just at our church. So it says in Numbers 14:4, and then they plotted among themselves, let's choose a new leader and go back to Egypt. Oh, those guys are wise, aren't they? Let's go back to Egypt where we were slaves. Get rid of this leadership. They're leading us down the wrong road. It's just like human nature when things get difficult to find someone to blame. We were in Hackensack about 3 months, and Kim come in one day and said, hey, we don't have any money in the checking account, and rent's going to be due in a few weeks, and we were trying to find jobs, and I was doing everything I could do, building decks, changing ceiling tiles in office buildings. I was doing everything I could do. She was out there looking. And there was a Saturday she told me this, and man, I was so depressed and I was angry. I was getting mad at God. And I was praying all day, and I was like, God, I don't get it. I obeyed you. I moved my family out here. We don't even have a bus ticket, money for a bus ticket to go back to Michigan, and I don't know what to do. And rent is coming due, and it was like a mountain in front of me, and it was a depressing day. And the next morning we went to church, and I hadn't turned the TV on that whole day, and went to church, and we come out of church. I feel bad for those people. I don't know what I preached on, but it stunk. I'm sure it did. It was probably depressing. Like when you're depressed, wallow in it and stay there and see what God. No, I don't know. I don't know what it was. And I was just so low. We come out of church, and literally there was a foot of snow on the car. And I'm like, what the heck, you know? And so we barely make it back home, and we get into that little apartment, and I turn on the TV, and they're calling for a heavy snow warning. Now, I grew up in Michigan. I've never even heard that term before. We have winter storm warnings, but a heavy snow warning? We got 37 inches of snow in North Jersey. And so when we had moved into that little place, our landlord had just off the cuff just said, hey, if you're ever looking for extra work, we plow snow and all that. And I'm thinking, I come from Michigan. I'm not plowing snow, you know. That's minimum wage. That's not going to do it. And so I was so depressed, so discouraged. I'm like, my attitude was, and I wasn't owning the fact that through good and bad, I'm going to obey God. I was not blaming God. I'm like, you know what? This is great. I'm broke. I have no food in the house, and now we're snowed in. Does it get any better than that? And so there comes a knock at the door, and open it up. It's my landlord. He goes, you ready to go to work? And my wife's like, yes, he's ready to go to work. Go. We worked 27 hours straight. And so the dude, right away, the first thing, he would hire ex-cons. So there was probably 50 ex-cons and people in trouble with the law and all that stuff. And the first thing he says, this is Pastor Mike. I'm like, why'd you say that? Why did you do that, you know? And so for that 27 hours, we would be in these communities plowing parking lots and all that, and I'm covered with ice and snow, and some guy would come up to me, and he'd look around, and he'd go, hey, listen, you're a pastor, right? Would you pray for me? This is going on in my life. I'm going back to jail. I don't know. I might get 5 years. I don't know. And this happened all night long. So at the end, that would have been Sunday night. I think I got Tuesday. We were done, and I'm just exhausted. I want to go home, be with my family. And they said, hey, we're going down to the pub. You want to come down to the pub with us? And I'm like, I'm a minister of the gospel. I haven't been in a bar or a pub since I became a believer. And I'm like, what are they going to think if they saw me there? And so I called my wife. I found a payphone. And she said, I've been praying, and God just wanted me to tell you that whatever they ask you to do, you need to do it. I'm like, okay. So we're going to get rip-roaring. No, we didn't. So I go into this Irish pub, and I tell the bartender, I said, make me a pot of coffee and just keep my cup full. And so I'm sitting around this. It was like a square bar kind of thing. And and I'm sitting there, and we're joking around. We're exhausted, and all these guys are coming in. They're like, "Hey, this is the pastor from New Life Assembly." Oh, this is great, And so one of them said, "Hey, tell us your story. How'd you become a Christian?" I got to share my testimony. There was probably 100 guys all standing around that bar. It felt more like a church than my church felt. And yeah. And they had heard that we were having a Friends Day coming up, and the bar owner said, "Hey, why don't you bring some flyers tomorrow, and we'll put them all up in the bar." They had them all through the bar and on the corners. Friends Day came. There was about 30 of those guys. It was like a herd of buffalo that came in. And we're in that. And for the rest of our time there, I would run into those guys on the street. And it was all because what I perceived as God letting me down God was like, no, I'm divinely guiding you. The great part about the story is that at the end of that 27 hours, my landlord came to me and said, "Did I tell you what we're paying you?" And I said, "No." He said, "Yeah, we pay you $25 an hour." And he goes, "It looks like I'm going to owe you money after this." I'm like, really? Do you know that for about 6 weeks, and you can go back and look, we would get a blizzard on a Friday night. I would work Friday night into Saturday, go to church on Sunday. We survived on snow plowing that whole time until I got sick of it and started praying a different way. Like, God, I don't want to do this anymore. But that's how God took care of us. And God was teaching me, amen. It was a teaching moment that I almost missed, but God was teaching me some stuff through this whole thing. So sometimes you don't have the faith to get through something, but someone else does, and you need to lean on theirs to get through it. And those 10 would have benefited, instead of blaming the leader, they would have benefited by leaning on Caleb and Joshua's faith. It cost them their children in the end greatly. As I close, and if you haven't picked up on that, I say that like 15 times. It means nothing. I'm just kidding. We're almost done. We were in, what time is it? It's 3 o'clock. Man, look at that. We got to Hackensack, and one of those 2 ladies that I told you about was a lady from the Czech Republic, had just gotten saved, knew nothing about God, grew up as an atheist. Her name was Hedda, and Hedda had 2 kids. Her husband, Vladimir, was a Russian guy, was one of the hardest guys you'd ever seen, man, just hard. And my wife was really working to disciple her. And there came a day where there was a knock at the door, and Hedda was at our door. And Kim, I'm just going to have you come real quick, and I promise we're almost done. I want you to share what happened with Hedda without crying. Let's see. We're going to take a bet here.
Possible.
$10. If she cries, no, all right.
Can't do it. So Hedda came to the door and asked if we could go for coffee. And she was...
See? Told you.
She was wrecked, and she said, I have to talk to somebody. So we went down to the cafe, and she said, "I'm pregnant." I said, "That's awesome." She was married. She said, "It's not awesome. We are managers of an apartment complex, and we're only allowed 2 children. If I have this baby, we lose our home. And my husband told me if I don't go take care of it, he will leave me. He'll disown me." And her mother-in-law lived with them, and she told her, "You have to abort this baby." Her parents said, "If you don't abort this baby, we will disown you." She said, "My question is, will the God," she called him, "the God, would he ever forgive me for doing this?" Sometimes God puts you in a place you don't have the answer, and you just have to lean on him. And I prayed with her, and I said, "Hedda, you can trust God with this. I know everyone's against you. I know this seems impossible, but you can trust God." I said, "I think the question is, could you ever forgive yourself? God is great in his mercy, but this baby, God allowed this child. He loves his child. He said, please don't do this." She had an appointment after meeting with me. I said, "Please just trust God. He can make a way." And she said, "I don't see how that can happen." So she went to the appointment. She didn't abort the child, but she got the information. I kept calling her. She wasn't picking up. I didn't know where she was at with it. I kept praying for her, and she kept coming to church. She didn't want to talk to me about it. She just started getting very inward, and we were really concerned about her. She was very tall, and she carried really well. You couldn't tell she was pregnant. She kept the child, even with the pressure daily from her husband and her mother-in-law and her whole family that were, they were in the Czech, right?
Mm-hmm.
They kept pressuring her. Hedda went through with it, and she had the baby.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Baby Nicole. Baby Nicole.
They lost their apartment. Her family disowned her. Her mother-in-law stopped talking to her, was extremely angry, and so was her husband. He was verbally abusive. And we lost Hedda from the church because they had to move. They went to Pennsylvania. But she had baby Nicole.
Yeah. So, you know, you'd think, okay, this is a great end of the story, but everything went wrong, other than the baby being, right? So she moved away. She was gone about 3 years, and she called us 3 years later, and she said, I was wondering if you and Miss Kim would come to Pennsylvania. We want to dedicate Nicole. My parents are going to be here from the Czech Republic, and they went to a little Assemblies of God church in the Poconos, and would you guys come and dedicate the baby? So we're like, yeah, that would be great. When we got there, we started asking questions. Nicole's now about 3 years old, and she said, yeah, when Vladimir comes home from work, Nicole's the first one to run to the door and jump into his arms. And even at 3 years old, she was a worshiper. She loved worship music. And so we meet at this little Assemblies of God church. It was like a Sunday night or something. And her parents don't speak English. They're standing there. And I'm thinking they're mad at us because of, you know. And we dedicated little Nicole. The father just kept sobbing, saying thank you in Polish over and over again. Well, we hugged everybody, left. We find out a week or so later that the very next day, it might have been a Saturday night, I don't remember. Maybe the next day, they all went to church. Mom and Dad from Czech Republic all got saved. And they went back, they started a Bible study in Czech Republic. All the siblings got saved. And so we'll fast forward now, about 5 years ago, we just called Hedda randomly, said, how are you doing? And she's like, yeah, I'm head of the women's ministries at my church. Nicole is a worship leader. And yeah. So we just end with this. If when we said yes years earlier, when the truck was still in the driveway, if we would have said no, none of that would have happened. Now, God probably would have worked out another way, but we were the ones that were supposed to be there. And by saying yes now, it affects those that come after you. In Hedda's case, it affected her whole family in Europe and also her whole family here. And so...
And her husband, Vladimir, ended up getting cancer, but on his deathbed, she led him to the Lord.
Yeah, amen. So, what are you ruled by? What are you ruled by? Thank you, babe. We're just going to end it this way. The worship team's going to just sing a song. Please don't leave. We just have a pastor appreciation. We're just going to pray over your pastor and leaders here. It's not going to take very long. But I just want to give you an opportunity as we go into this last song here. If you're struggling with this, you're struggling by what you see, you're struggling by how you feel, you're struggling by what others are saying to you, and you just feel like God is speaking to you, and you just need to have a measure of faith to see beyond all that. As we worship, I just want to ask you, right where you're at, it's nice and dark in here, it's just a precious space. Just maybe you could stand right where you're at and just raise your hands to the Lord and say, God, just give me your eyes to see. Give me your vision. Let me see beyond the giant in front of me and see your purposes. Let whatever I do today affect my children and my children's children.